I invite you to turn in your Bibles to John chapter 1. We're making our way through the Gospel of John. And we're finishing up the prologue of John 1. That's the first 18 verses. We're going to be looking at verses 14 to 18 this morning. For the sake of context, we'll begin reading in verse 1. John chapter 1, beginning in verse 1. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things were made through him, and without him was not anything made that was made. In him was life, and the life was the light of men. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. There was a man sent from God, whose name was John. He came as a witness, to bear witness about the light, that all might believe through him. He was not the light, but came to bear witness about the light. The true light, which gives light to everyone, was coming into the world. He was in the world, and the world was made through him. Yet the world did not know him. He came to his own, and his own people did not receive him. But to all who did receive him, who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God, who were born not of blood, nor of the will of the flesh, nor of the will of man, but of God. And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. And we have seen his glory, glory as of the only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth. John bore witness about him and cried out, "This was he of whom I said, he who comes after me ranks before me, because he was before me. For from his fullness we have all received grace upon grace. For the law was given through Moses. Grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. No one has ever seen God. The only God who is at the Father's side, he has made him known." May God bless the reading of his word. In the Chronicles of Narnia, the Magician's Nephew, C.S. Lewis describes the beginning of the world of Narnia. Aslan the lion is seen standing with his face to the rising sun and his mouth wide open in song. As he walks and sings, the valley begins to grow green with grass. It spreads out from the lion like a pool and runs up the sides of the hills like a wave. Then flowers and heather appear on the hillside and move out before him. As Aslan begins to sing a more wilder song, showers of birds fly out of the trees, butterflies flutter, and bees get to work on the flowers. At this point, you can barely hear the song of the lion, as there is so much cawing, cooing, crowing, braying, neighing, baying, barking, lowing, bleating, and trumpeting. Finally, in a deep, wild voice, Aslan says, "Narnia, Narnia, Narnia, awake, love, think, speak, be walking trees, be talking beasts, be divine waters." I like this picture of Aslan singing Narnia into existence. And thus, I don't believe that it's merely fantasy. You know, when you read the first chapter of Genesis, it sounds just as fantastic as Lewis's world of Narnia. You consider Genesis 1, verse 31, which says that God saw everything that he had made, and behold, it was very good. What God created was perfect. The birds of the air were good. The beasts of the field were good. The fish of the sea were good. The universe was good. The earth was good. The man and the woman were very good. They walked with God in perfect relationship with him and with each other. All of us long for what Adam and Eve had. We long for restoration from sin. We know too well the effects of the fall, how it wasn't long after God's perfect creation that sin came into the world and death through sin, Romans 5 verse 12 says. We learn a great deal about sin in the opening pages of Genesis chapter 3. But we learn a great deal about grace here in the first chapter of John. So let us turn our attention now to our text. Look with me there at verse 14. And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we have seen his glory as of the only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth. This is the first appearance of the Word since verse 1, and it's actually the last time it will appear in John's Gospel. So far, we have seen how the Word has existed before time itself and is the one through whom creation came into existence. The Word is the one in whom life is found and is also the light of the world. The Word is in intimate communion with the Father and is the one through whom the right to become children of God is possible. We have seen so much majesty surrounding the Word up until this point. But in verse 14, we read about one of the most important events in history, and that is that the Word, the Son of God, Jesus Christ, became human without ceasing to be God. The Word became flesh and dwelt among us. This is, of course, what the angel alludes to in Matthew chapter 1, verse 23, when announcing the birth of Jesus. Behold, the angel says, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and they shall call his name Emmanuel, which means God with us. In Colossians chapter 2, verse 9, the apostle Paul writes concerning the person of Jesus Christ, for in him the whole fullness of deity dwells bodily. Right? In the humanity of Jesus Christ dwelt all the fullness of the Holy Trinity. John actually uses the word flesh here, which refers to the whole human being. So think, bones, blood, organs, skin, etc. It's the whole person. One commentator writes, flesh is the most vulnerable, the most corruptible, the most easily destructible part of the human body. In a word, the most impermanent. To think that the eternal would become impermanent. Philippians 2, verses 6 to 7 puts it this way: though Jesus Christ was in the form of God, he did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped, but emptied himself by taking the form of a servant, being born in the likeness of men. Yet, in becoming flesh, the Word, the Son of God, Jesus Christ, did not cease to be God. This is a very important point. But how does it work? How can Jesus Christ be both God and man? The short answer is we don't really know how it works. Now, that being said, we do know some things. In the words of the Athanasian Creed, we believe and confess that our Lord Jesus Christ, God's Son, is both God and man equally. He is God from the essence of the Father, begotten before time, and he is man from the essence of his mother, born in time. Completely God, completely man, with a rational soul and human flesh. Equal to the Father as regards divinity, less than the Father as regards humanity. Although he is God and man, yet Christ is not two, but one. He is one, however, not by his divinity being turned into flesh, but by God's taking humanity to himself. He is one, certainly not by the blending of his essence, but by the unity of his person. For just as one man is both rational soul and flesh, so too the one Christ is both God and man. Now, there are a lot of complexities that come with that. But this is foundational. We actually sing a number of Christmas carols that reflect this reality. I don't know if you necessarily paid attention to that this Christmas. Christ by highest heaven adored, Christ the everlasting Lord, late in time behold him come, offspring of a virgin's womb. Veiled in flesh the Godhead see, hail the incarnate deity, pleased as man with men to dwell, Jesus our Emmanuel. God of God and light of light begotten, lo, he abhors not the virgin's womb. Very God, begotten, not created. Oh, come, let us adore him. Oh, come, let us adore him. Oh, come, let us adore him. Christ, the Lord. Yet at the same time, we should not be surprised that this remains a glorious mystery to us. For if we could comprehend all of what it means that Jesus Christ is both God and man, it would cease to be awesome. The Word became flesh and dwelt among us. Or as some translations say, the Word became flesh and took up residence among us. In other words, this isn't a temporary visit. It's a permanent dwelling. In the Old Testament, God dwelt with his people in the tabernacle and then later in the temple. But never had God dwelt with his people in this manner. Jesus Christ is the dwelling of God par excellence. No longer does God command his people to make for him a dwelling, for he has made a dwelling for himself in the person of Jesus Christ. Now, there are significant implications of this. One being that the presence of God in Jesus makes the relationship between Jesus and the church all the more significant. Right? Writing to the church in Corinth, the Apostle Paul says, do you not know that you are God's temple? And that God's Spirit dwells in you? 1 Corinthians 3, verse 16. That the presence of God through the Son in the children of God transforms the church into the dwelling place of God. Now, by church, we're not talking about building. We're talking about people. Right? The church, the people, are the body of Christ and individually members of it. 1 Corinthians 12, verse 27 says, And so through word and through deed, the church is an ambassador of God through Christ. Where we go, the presence of God also goes. Well, what a privilege that is. Getting back to the text, the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we have seen his glory. All right, now when John uses the word we, to whom is he referring? Well, initially he's referring to those who were physically present with Jesus. Right? He's referring to real eyewitnesses of a real Jesus. Now that's important. Jesus was not an apparition. He was not a ghost. He had a physical body, right? He ate, he drank, he slept, he wept, he suffered, and he died. Think about that. Christ became flesh in order to die. The Word became flesh so that the death of Christ would be possible. Hebrews 2, verses 14 to 15 says, "Since therefore the children share in flesh and blood, he himself likewise partook of these things, so that through death he might destroy the one who has the power of death, that is the devil, and deliver all those who through fear of death were subject to lifelong slavery." So we have seen his glory, and not only has the glory as of the only Son from the Father not consumed us on account of our sin, but the Word became flesh and dwelt among us and died in our place. What glory is that? In the Old Testament, the glory of God was revealed in a number of different ways. The miracles of Egypt, the giving of the law, and also at particular moments when God appeared to his chosen servants, like when Moses asked the Lord, "Please show me your glory," and the Lord made his goodness to pass before Moses. And in all those manifestations of glory in the Old Testament, we see the glory of God being revealed, but it's incomplete. It's incomplete. The hope was always that all would see the glory of God. And what is John saying here? He's saying that in Jesus Christ, we have seen the glory of God. We've seen it. Right? And John is referring to more than simply Christ being transfigured on the mountain, although that was certainly a display of the glory of God. But here, John is saying that we have seen the glory of God in the incarnation of Jesus Christ. We have seen the glory of God in the Son of God taking on human flesh. Now, there are those who stumble over the word son. Glory as of the only Son from the Father. They think that God had sex with Mary and produced a son, that kind of thing. That's not what the Bible means when the Bible refers to the Son of God, or the only Son from the Father. What do we know about the Word up until this point? Well, number one, we know that the Word is eternal. He didn't have a beginning. He was there in the beginning. Number two, we know that he is not the Father, but was with the Father. Number three, we know that he is God. Number four, we know that he is uncreated, that all things were created through him, and without him was not anything made that was made, which means that he's not made. He's not part of creation. He's the author of creation. So that's not what is being conveyed when we talk about the Son of God, the only Son from the Father. And again, there's so much complexity here that we don't quite know how it all works. But what we do know is that Jesus Christ is God dwelling with us. But this begs the question, how can a holy God dwell in the midst of an unholy people? How can a holy God dwell in the midst of an unholy people? Right? You think of Adam and Eve. They were kicked out of the Garden of Eden because God could not dwell in the midst of an unholy people. A flood wiped out all but 8 persons because God could not dwell in the midst of an unholy people. Humanity was spread out at Babel because God could not dwell in the midst of an unholy people. Israel was shipped off to Babylon, all because a holy God cannot dwell in the midst of an unholy people. And yet, what do we read here in verse 14? The Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we have seen his glory. Glory is of the only Son from the Father. And here's the kicker, full of grace and truth. How can a holy God dwell in the midst of an unholy people? Because he's full of grace and truth. One commentator writes, grace is God's love coming to sinners. It is God's ultimate love communicated to us in Christ. Christ embodies God's grace. When grace is poured out, or, let's put it another way, when grace puts on flesh and dwells among us, it's more than adequate. We're not lacking anything at that point. Look at verse 16. For from his fullness we have all received grace upon grace. When we receive grace, we receive all that we need. In the 17th century, a young boy was born into a Christian home. For the first 6 years of his life, he heard the truths of the gospel and was deeply loved. Sadly, though, his parents died. The orphan boy went to live with his relatives and was mistreated, abused, and ridiculed for his interest in Christ. The orphan couldn't tolerate the situation, and though still a boy, he fled and joined the Royal Navy. In the Navy, the boy's life went downhill. He became known as a brawler, was whipped many times, and even participated in the keel hauling of some of his comrades. Finally, while he was still young, he deserted the Royal Navy and fled to Africa, where he attached himself to a Portuguese slave trader. There, his life really reached its lowest point. There were times when he actually ate off the floor on his hands and knees. He escaped and then became attached to another slave trader as the first mate on his ship. But the young man's pattern of life had become desperately depraved. He stole the ship's whiskey and got so drunk that he fell overboard. He was close to drowning when one of his shipmates harpooned him and brought him back on board. As a result, the young man had a huge scar on his side for the rest of his life. He could not get much lower. Finally, in the midst of a great storm off the coast of Scotland, after days and days of pumping water out of the boat, the young man began to reflect on verses he had heard as a boy and was marvelously converted. The new life he found is reflected in these famous words, "Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now am found, was blind, but now I see." The young man is John Newton, author of the hymn, Amazing Grace. He became one of the great preachers of the 17th century, all because of the amazing grace of God. No one is beyond the power of God's grace. Romans 5 verse 6 says that while we were still weak, at the right time, Christ died for the ungodly. God could have chosen, you see, to become flesh as a judge or as an executioner, right? And we would have been entirely guilty and God would have been entirely just, but God did not become flesh in that way. No, God became flesh in order to be gracious to us. I referenced this earlier in Exodus 34. As the Lord's goodness passed by Moses, the Lord proclaimed, the Lord, a God merciful and gracious, slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness, keeping steadfast love for thousands, forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin. Exodus 34, verses 6 to 7. Right? This is who God has revealed himself in the person of Jesus Christ, a God full of grace. And when the grace of God enters our lives overflow with grace, right? Grace upon grace. It never runs out. Right? We begin to live as we were intended to live. Right? John Newton became known for his godly marriage, which is remarkable considering the sin, the philandering, the wandering, the sensuality that he had previously experienced. But you see, when the grace of God entered his life and he matured in Christ, he enjoyed a marriage that was an example to all and actually became one of the greatest aspects of his ministry. Or consider the early church in the book of Acts. Acts 4, verse 33 says that great grace was upon them all, to the extent that a man by the name of Barnabas sold a field that belonged to him and brought the money and laid it at the apostles' feet for them to distribute to any who had need. Acts 4, verse 37. For from his fullness we have all received grace upon grace. There was no limit to the grace of God through Jesus Christ. Grace continues to flow. And as the grace we have received flows out to others, more grace will come, and then more grace will come, and then even more grace will come. Martin Luther said this. He said, "This spring is inexhaustible. It is full of grace and truth from God. It never loses anything, no matter how much we draw, but remains an infinite fountain of all grace and truth. The more you draw from it, the more abundantly it gives of the water that springs into eternal life. Just as the sun is not darkened by the whole world enjoying its light and could indeed light up 10 worlds, just as 100,000 lights might be lit from one light and not detract from it. Just as a learned man is able to make 1,000 others learned, and the more he gives, the more he has, so is Christ our Lord, an infinite source of all grace, so that if the whole world would draw enough grace and truth from it to make the world all angels, yet it would not lose a drop. The fountain always runs over, full of grace." The Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we have seen his glory, glory as of the only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth. Don't miss that. And truth. God is indeed gracious to us, but he is also true to himself. Look at verse 17. For the law was given through Moses, grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. And John isn't contrasting Moses and Jesus, the law with grace, in order to say that Moses and the law are lesser than or unnecessary or not good. Right? Romans 7 verse 12 says that the law is holy and the commandment is holy and righteous and good. That's not what John is doing here in this contrasting of Moses and Jesus and law and grace. No, God is indeed a God merciful and gracious, slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness, keeping steadfast love for thousands, forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin, but who will by no means clear the guilty, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children and the children's children to the third and fourth generation. That's the full of Exodus 34, verses 6 to 7. Right? Sin must be dealt with. Right? As we've established, a holy God cannot simply dwell in the midst of an unholy people and have nothing happen. Therefore, Christ is simultaneously full of truth, where sin must be punished, and full of grace, where he takes the punishment for sin we deserve upon himself. That's how he can be both full of grace and full of truth. And that's why it matters that he's full of grace and full of truth. He's not just full of one or the other. He's full of both, because we need both. At the cross, justice and mercy flowed freely. This is the glory of God that John saw. And if we are children of God, then we too have seen his glory. All right, now maybe you're wondering, how have we exactly seen his glory? We weren't around to see the physical appearance of Christ. Well, Isaiah 53 verse 2 says that he had no form or majesty that we should look at him, and no beauty that we should desire him. It's not that his physical appearance was glorious necessarily. Besides, in John 20, verse 29, Jesus says, "Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed." Okay, but we haven't seen the miracles of Christ. We weren't there to see what he did. Well, that's fine. There were those there who saw the works of Christ and did not think anything glorious about him. And in fact, they wanted to kill him. No, the glory of God revealed in the person of Jesus Christ is seen in the fullness of grace and truth, which is clearly seen at the cross, but which we see through eyes of faith. That's how we see. We see through eyes of faith. In the words of the Apostle Peter, though you have not seen him, you love him. Though you do not now see him, you believe in him and rejoice with joy that is inexpressible and filled with glory, obtaining the outcome of your faith, the salvation of your souls. 1 Peter 1, verses 8 to 9. In John 17, verse 24, Jesus prays, "Father, I desire that they also whom you have given me may be with me where I am, to see my glory that you have given me because you loved me before the foundation of the world." What's the ultimate goal of Jesus' prayer? It's that we would see the fullness of his glory. But in order for that to happen, we need the blindness and the darkness of our hearts to be removed. 2 Corinthians 4, verse 4 says that the God of this world has blinded the minds of unbelievers to keep them from seeing the light of the gospel of the glory of Christ, who is the image of God. As we looked at last week, we are naturally blind to who Christ is. There is a darkness in our soul that keeps us from seeing the glory of the Son of God. What we need is the new birth. Right? We need to be born again, Jesus will say later in John chapter 3. And when we are born again, when we receive the fullness of Christ's grace and truth through eyes of faith, our blind eyes are open to see the glory of Christ. And what is the result of this overflowing of grace and truth into our lives? Well, essentially a reverse of the curse of Genesis 3. And that's why we began by looking at creation and the sin that came into the world in Genesis 3. Because in Revelation chapter 22, verses 3 to 4, John writes that in the new heaven and the new earth, no longer will there be anything accursed. But the throne of God and of the Lamb will be in it, and his servants will worship him. They shall see his face, and his name will be on their foreheads. Right? We'll be perfect. There will be no more death, no more sorrow, no more pain. There will be no more abortion, no more euthanasia, no more destroying of the image of God in humanity. For those things will have passed away, and we will enjoy life the way it was always intended to be. And we will see the very face of God. Verse 18, no one has ever seen God. In Exodus 33, verse 20, the Lord said to Moses, you cannot see my face, for man shall not see me and live. So the Lord actually says to Moses, behold, there is a place by me where you shall stand on the rock, and while my glory passes by, I will put you in the cleft of the rock, and I will cover you with my hand until I have passed by. Then I will take away my hand, and you shall see my back, but my face you shall not see. Exodus 33, verses 21 to 23. The desire to see God resides deep within the human soul. We were created to be in relationship with God, even if the true weight of such a sight of the fullness of his glory might be death. But in the person of Jesus Christ, the Word made flesh, John says, we see the glory of God. In John 14, verse 8, Philip says to Jesus, Lord, show us the Father, and it will be enough for us. What does Jesus say? Have I been with you for so long? And you still do not know me, Philip. Whoever has seen me has seen the Father. So what Jesus is saying is that the disciples could look into the ordinary face of Jesus and see something that no human had ever seen, and that is the face of God. The God that Moses could not see was seen in Jesus. And John writes in the book of Revelation that we will one day behold him face to face. In the new heaven and the new earth, we will see the very face of God. All right, 1 Corinthians 2, verse 9. What no eye has seen, nor ear heard, nor the heart of man imagined what God has prepared for those who love him. What glorious realities await the people of God. And so when we kind of boil down this prologue, these first 18 verses in John 1, it's essentially setting the stage for the rest of the book. You know, it's kind of laying out everything that we're going to see in the rest of the Gospel of John. But what John is doing is he's introducing us to Jesus, who will in turn introduce us to God. The story of Jesus is ultimately the story of God. Who is God? What is God like? Look at Jesus. Look at Jesus. Behold his glory. Glories of the only Son from the Father. See him for the glory that he is. Receive his grace and truth in all its fullness. If you know Jesus, you know God. But if you don't know Jesus, then you don't know God. So get to know him. Get to know him by knowing Jesus. Paul Harvey tells about a winter night on which a farmer heard a thumping sound against the kitchen door. He went to a window and watched as tiny shivering sparrows were attracted to the warmth inside and beat in vain against the glass storm door. The farmer bundled up and trudged through fresh snow to open the barn for the struggling birds. He turned on the lights, tossed some hay in a corner, and sprinkled a trail of saltine crackers to direct them into the barn. But the sparrows hid in the darkness, afraid of him. He tried various tactics, circling behind the birds to drive them toward the barn, tossing crumbs into the air toward them, retreating to his house to see if they could flutter into the barn on their own. Nothing worked. He had terrified them. The birds could not understand that he was trying to help them. He withdrew to his house and watched the doomed sparrows through his window. As he stared, he thought, if only I could become a bird. If only I could become one of them, just for a moment, then I would not frighten them so, and I could show them the way to warmth and safety. Probably know where this is going. At the same moment, another thought dawned on him. He had grasped the incarnation of Jesus Christ. Now, a man's becoming a bird is nothing compared to God's becoming man. The analogy breaks down at a certain point. But the concept of a holy God confining himself to a human body is too much for us to grasp. And really ought to draw us into worship. Worship. Praise of this one true God who is God and man completely. Jesus Christ is the Word of God. He is pre-existent. He has a privileged place with God. He is God. He was active in the creation of all things. He is life. He is light. He overcomes darkness. He came into the world. He gives us the right to become children of God. He is the only Son of the Father, begotten before all ages, distinct from the Father, yet sharing the same essence with the Father. He became incarnate as a man. He condescended to dwell in our midst. He's greater than John the Baptist. He's greater than Moses. He makes visible the invisible God. He's at the Father's side. He's full of glory. He's full of grace. He's full of truth. Oh, come, let us adore him. Oh, come, let us adore him. Oh, come, let us adore him. Christ, the Lord. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, what words can we utter in response to such mystery and majesty? We praise you for the eternal begotten Son, our Lord Jesus Christ, now and forever, a man like us, a God-man, begotten, not created, in every way as we are, yet without sin. Give us minds to understand these things as best we can. Give us hearts to embrace them. Give us wills to obey. And give us voices to sing now praise to you, our great triune God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen.